into the pre-show again. Another day.
Another
day of-
pre-show.
Another pre-show. We have a pre-show every day for our lives. And it just so happens that this is a pre-show to the part of our lives where we're doing the NGE Shadowverse Open number 4 is going to be coming up in just a little bit. But before then, we're going to talk a little bit about the JCG, talk a little bit about Shadowverse, talk a little bit about competitive. And we have a very special guest joining us today. Last week was Envy Bear, but this week we have joining us another very beloved member of the community, probably the coolest guy you will ever see, meet, hear talk. He's just loaded with the cool genes, and he's a commentator for Excelsior Gaming's community tournaments over the weekend, as well as for Jor Dude's bi-weekly, at the correct term, once every 2 weeks.
That's right. I've actually never met him, but talked to him. He's a pretty cool guy. Who is he?
So we have him on air with us right now. Mofumoka, how are you doing in the early morning of Japan's side of the universe?
I just woke up and I meditated under a waterfall for a while. Made sure I was prepared. But good morning indeed.
Wait, you meditate under a waterfall every morning? You just wake up and you do that?
It's pretty normal here.
Is it
It's pretty normal.
is it mountain spring water or lake water?
It's like heavenly water, like comes
heavenly
down.
water.
Oh my gosh.
From a clear
You see,
sky.
that must be the reason why you have such great hair. To be honest, I'm a little bit jealous. I'm going to
You're jealous of hair.
allow me to visit you, Mofu, so that I may partake in the heavenly waters that bathe you every morning. Please. I beg of
To
you.
be honest, Rainy, if there's anyone on Earth who doesn't need to be jealous of hair, it's you.
Oh,
That's the
thank you.
point I was trying to make.
Wow, we're already kicking off this stream real well. Hey, let's talk a little bit about JCG. JCG is a tournament that happens over in Japan. Very huge Shadowverse tournament for them. There's a lot of people who go in and play in their open brackets every week. 2 of them, one on Saturday, one on Sunday. So we have 2 sets of winners, 2 people taking first place, 2 people taking second place in each of those tournaments. So, interesting thing for me when we looked over kind of the recap and kind of took a look at the scene is that it's coming. The times are coming, and I'm sure Mofu will tell us a lot more about this, but everybody is playing Shadow and Dragon. I know I said that last week, but oh my god, if you look at some of the deck usage rates, just incredible. You've got some 25%, a quarter of the decks Dragoncraft, and you've got upwards of 45% of the decks available.
On Saturday, in the playoffs, 90% were shadow decks.
We're Shadowcraft.
Yeah.
We're Shadowcraft.
Yeah.
Yeah. We can actually look at some of those stats right now. I believe this is for Saturday's qualifying tournaments. Hopefully get a little bit of extra zoom on that because those numbers are real small. But if you can see, those numbers next to Shadowcraft is the little icon for Luna there. 71%, 0.92%. Staggering, Mofu. Why? Why is this happening, Mofu? Tell us a little bit about what makes Dragon and Shadow so used. What is so great about them? I mean, I think we've seen that over the course of Tempest of the Gods, kind of them repeatedly proving themselves on those decks, but just incredibly popular. And more to speak on that, Forestcraft has also been falling in popularity, as well as we were talking about Vengeance Blood last week. We were discussing the possibility with Envy that might be a thing that comes up, but people are still not flocking to those options. Maybe you can speak a little more to that, Mofu.
Well, the first thing that I want to say is that while alright, Shadowverse players are not surprised by 2-deck formats, and that we sort of just came out of the tail end of the one being kind of fixed, and that we know what it's like when there's only Rune and Forest, for example, was the last time this happened. There's not being any reason to not just play these 2 classes, but it was for a slightly different reason back then. Because whereas Daria Rune and Roach Forest used to have this very unique interaction where they covered each other's bad matchups, and that led to a lot of people experimenting how to take advantage of that. Shadow and Dragon aren't 2 decks that actually stare at each other in terms of trying to figure out each other and help the other work out its worst matchups, but it's rather that these are 2 classes that are very difficult to devise a bad matchup to. Most other classes aren't holding any tools that deal with the way that Shadow and Dragon work, and so it comes as no surprise to anyone, I think, to see in the no ban format that JCG has always gone by, that it's more or less just every player picking Shadow and Dragon.
Sure. Let's take a look at some of the deck usage rates in the playoffs here, and this is where Sterling was talking about the 90% usage rate, and of course, for whatever reason that I haven't really figured out, they boost their percentages up to 200%. So if you just like cut that in half, that's
Oh, I see what you mean.
more accurate representation of what it was. But almost half of the decks that represent in the playoffs for Shadowcraft, we see a 0% representation from Swordcraft, and that is also a trend as well between Swordcraft, Runecraft, Havencraft over the last few weeks. One or two of them have been not represented in the playoffs at all. The other interesting thing to mention is I just remember that we didn't really talk about the winners. For Saturday, the first place finisher was a player called Amiringo, and he actually came with a Forestcraft deck as well as a Shadowcraft deck. So taking first place with Forestcraft, but even then, Forestcraft decks have gone through some kind of an evolution. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But second place is Rakun on Saturday, and then on Sunday, the first place finisher was Kaede, and on second place was Aspada. So all three of those remaining players, Dragoncraft, Shadowcraft, as Mofu was talking about, everybody's just bringing those two leaders to the table. For in regards to Forestcraft, we talked a little bit about this last week, but it really seems now that the decisive move for a lot of the decks that are being brought into competitive is to remove White Wolf and Silver Bolt. Mofu, could you bring us some insight about kind of where this shift is coming from and how you foresee it playing out?
I feel like the shift that occurred with Forest dropping Wolf is actually mostly due to the fact that Forest as a class used to not really have a win condition that would come out late. And Wolf was a very interesting combo starter that synergized really well with Roach, just because the zero cost Silver Bolt kind of turns any hand that has a Roach in it with 9 play points into some kind of lethal. However, I feel like people are starting to move away from it and back to just Roach lists, because the slot that White Wolf appeared to occupy, specifically turn 8, is now actually occupied in Roach, in that we've gotten Crystalia Erin from Tempest of the Gods. And she both provides a lot of tempo and recovery that Wolf didn't, but also, next to her, it seems that a lot of players are now picking up Jungle Warden as well. So these two cards not only take up the space that White Wolf appeared and once occupied himself, but also they do the exact same thing.
Right.
In that Aaron recovers, and then Jungle Warden sets up the same amount of damage. That works really well with Roach.
Yeah, and we saw, of course, Amiringo taking that to a first place finish. Now, something interesting that I want to ask you about kind of leveraging your insights is, let's talk about a little bit of the intricacies of the different Dragoncraft decks, because before the expansion hits, people were using kind of the Sahak Wheel, Lucifer, kind of neutral craft, but it was nowhere near as popular. I know that you had some thoughts about why you think these decks started becoming so heavily successful, as well as what allows these decks to have minute differences. I mean, we see things like Olivia, we see things like more Storm-heavy Dragoncraft decks, and then we also see, like last week, the winner brought Imperial Dragoon. Talk to me a little bit more about that.
I feel like with Dragon's case, we have had one really interesting thing happen, which hasn't really happened before. But Tempest of the Gods with a single card has fused two archetypes, in that before Tempest of the Gods, Ramp Dragon usually divided into two very separate deck lists, that being Neutral Ramp, which would run, as you mentioned, the Sahak Wheel Lucifer list, but there was also a Storm Ramp deck that would kind of cut that neutral synergy altogether just to play into Storms. And players don't have to do that anymore, because Wind Reader Zell, that single card alone, has turned Sahak Wheel herself into a combo piece for Storm, working really well with Ouroboros on the side. And so I think because these decks have been pushed together with such synergy, now there's like a couple of spaces left over in the list, which is where most of the experimentation happens. We've seen Dark Angel Olivia, and just usually some kind of rogue legendary card teched in. Imperial Dragoon was a pretty glorious tech in the last tournament, taking this place. But also a lot of flex in what Storm cool. That a lot of decks play now.
What about your thoughts in regards to kind of where mid-range Shadow kind of sits, it really seems like it's kind of the king of the expansion, really, if I may describe it that way. Mid-range Shadow seems the go-to most successful deck that you can play, even challenging something like Aggro Shadow.
I feel that, well, at the beginning of the expansion, players were really afraid of what it looked like Aggro Shadow was going to become. This may have been because we were already so terrified of how strong Aggro Shadow was getting, that it wasn't until later we started to realize that the new synergy we got with Prince Catacomb, with pretty much every early game minion or any card that can swarm the board, works better with Demon Lord Yaktar than it does with Aggro Shadow's previous win condition, which was always Phantom Howl or something along those lines. Because you always have the board now, you can do just as consistently well in the early game, and then branch out into a much stronger and more resilient endgame with mid-range than Aggro was ever capable of doing.
So mid-range Shadow kind of excelling itself in many ways off of the expansion here. Some of the final thoughts I would love to collect from you, Mofu, is last week we asked Envy if there was any craft you wish to win, could win this tournament. What craft would that be? And she said Havencraft. She wanted Havencraft to shed away its biases of it being an underpowered class and underrepresented craft. Do you have any such thoughts about which you would like to see win?
For me, it has to be Bloodcraft. My favorite class in the expansion by far, with how it's changed a little bit, especially with the legendary Belphegor. That is probably one of my favorite cards in the game now. So I'd be overjoyed to see Blood actually doing well in a tournament.
Bloodcraft did do very well in the second week of the Shadowverse Open. Since then, very similar to kind of in the Japanese scene, it seems like after that point, something happened behind the scenes outside of competition that I feel like convinces people, maybe we shouldn't.
Everyone just decided, nah.
I think it might be the safety, the consistency, of playing Dragon and Shadow. Playing Bloodcraft is very scary, right?
It's heavily dependent on its curve to be absolutely perfect. You need the 2-drop Blood Wolf or Spiderweb Imp into Devil of Vengeance. And then if you've got 3 Soul Dealers and then 3 Belphegors, those 2 cards kind of fulfill the same role on that deck. And if you get that curve, I mean, you're set against something like Dragoncraft, who's going to be ramping up.
What do you think, Mofu, is needed to be done to convince more people to run Bloodcraft in tournament play?
I feel like the current opinion of Bloodcraft, especially the Vengeance list that has been gaining so much popularity, is when it was first discovered, it was perhaps the strongest deck we've seen aside from Dragon and Shadow, and one of the only ones that was able to do really well against both matchups. But I think a lot of its loss of popularity has been, as you said, its consistency is a little shaky. It can very consistently activate Vengeance on itself by turn 4. 6 copies of activators is really, really nice. However, what it does after that tends to be you have to win the game in just a few turns, or else you're going to burn out pretty badly.
I think once you start reaching the point where Dragoncraft can hit kind of the 8, 9, 10 play points region, that's really when it starts to get real dangerous. Hopefully we'll see that today. I think for me, I still really want to see Bloodcraft. And I think I'm a little bit on Mofu's side here, where I feel like Bloodcraft, I want to see it win a tournament, especially with the cool combos that it can do with Vengeance now. But I still want to see Swordcraft win, man. Swordcraft, I think the cards are so cool. They've got the coolest looking cards in the game. I want it to win, and it's come real close, but it's seeming like it's falling out of favor now. What do you feel about kind of the lesser looked at classes like Runecraft, Swordcraft, Havencraft, and Blood right now, Mofu? I guess we spoke a little bit about Blood, but the other 3.
I absolutely agree. To start with that, I am such a huge fan of just the flavor and artwork of Sword that no matter how the class plays or how badly it does, it'll always be one of my favorites. But I feel like a lot of the lesser looked at classes have a struggle where they weren't really pushed that much with this expansion, due mostly to the fact that they were already doing decently well before it, with maybe just the exception of Haven, which is having a bit of an identity crisis lately. But Sword hasn't changed much. It's gotten Luminous Mage, which is a fantastic card, but other than that, it's always had this very linear strategy of wanting to curve out, play Albedos, and just storm its opponent to death in the mid-late game.
Luminous Mage.
And that's just not really...
Sorry, go ahead.
it's not really keeping up very well with how fast the game is starting to get.
That does seem to be like the consistent issue with kind of just keeping up with the pace of the game. We'll see if Swordcraft can kind of overcome that. Mofumoka, before we get ready for the start of NGE Shadowverse Open number 4, any last words that you want to say? Anything that you want to throw out to the viewers out there? Anything you want to mention to your adoring fans?
Just shout outs to everyone who got you gasms in the chat whenever I show up. But thank you. I love every single person in chat. I effectively have a crush on everyone, and I'm only here today and continuing to cast and talk just because of a lot of the positive reception I've been getting.
Awesome. So, if only I had a keyboard I could add to those gotcha-gasms. But with that, thank you, Mofo. You'll be hearing more of him in the midway point of our tournament, but for now, we're going to take a little bit of a break, and when we come back, NGE Shadowverse Open number 4 kicks off.